Welcome back to this next video in which we are studying headaches. Okay, so in this next video we're now going to begin discussing the story of the pathophysiology of migraine headaches. Now just before we start that, let me give you the warning again that what we're about to discuss is controversial. The story is going to have holes in it. There are going to be bits that I cannot explain to you because they're not understood at present. And it is also controversial, so bits of it may change in the future. So be aware of that. I'm only going to be able to tell you what my understanding of the best current theory of migraine headaches is. So, with that warning out of the way then, let's actually tell the story. So we begin then with someone who suffers from migraine. So remember, we don't believe that anyone can actually suffer from a migraine headache. You have to be genetically susceptible to be able to suffer from migraine headaches. And these people, we say, suffer from migraine, the disorder where you are susceptible to suffering from migraine headaches. And the thing that is different about the brains of the people with migraine is that their brains, for reasons that we don't understand, but genetic reasons, are susceptible to a phenomenon called cortical spreading depression. That is the phenomenon that occurs episodically and which can activate meningeal nociceptors to give rise to the migraine headache. So we begin then with someone with migraine, so someone who is genetically susceptible and who can suffer from migraine headaches, can suffer from this brain phenomenon that is going to give rise to the migraine headaches. We then expose them to one of the triggers for an actual migraine headache. So we have the list of potential triggers here. Emotional stress, so they can have a stressful day and that can trigger a migraine headache, or fasting, or sleep deprivation, or physical stress, physical overexertion, or certain foods and drinks, notably alcohol. So we expose them to a trigger, and what this is going to do is it's going to activate this brain phenomenon in ways that we do not understand, but we think that what must happen is it activates this brain phenomenon called cortical spreading depression. So firstly, let me just write down the name of this brain phenomenon. So this is really important, so let's write it down nice and neatly over here. So cortical, because it's going to affect the cerebral cortex, spreading, because it's going to spread over the cerebral cortex, and then depression, because it's going to involve the neurons of the cerebral cortex that are affected becoming depressed. Their activity is going to be reduced from what it should be. Okay, and for short, cortical spreading depression can be abbreviated down to CSD. So, this phenomenon, cortical spreading depression, it's a very poorly understood phenomenon. So this is where we meet the first holes in our explanation. It's not well understood how this actually happens. So when I now describe this phenomenon to you, it's going to be just a description. I'm not going to actually tell you how this happens. I'm going to tell you what happens. I cannot tell you how it happens. I'll be able to give you some clues as to what might be happening, but I can't give you a precise explanation as to exactly how this happens. So, let me tell you what this actually is then. So this is a phenomenon that bears some similarities to what happens in epilepsy. So remember, in epilepsy, large chunks of the brain behave in a very simple way. Normally, remember, the neurons in the brain, their activation is extremely complicated. When you look at the brain normally and it's functioning normally, the pattern of activation of neurons, the pattern of action potentials is extremely complicated, and a neuron only fires an action potential if it's received enough stimulation from other neurons. So there is an incredible pattern of which neurons are activated at the moment, and this pattern evolves through time, and it's an incredibly complex array of activation of neurons. And of course, this is what gives rise to logical thought and all the other incredible things that our brain does. This incredibly complex arrangement of activation of neurons in time. However, in epilepsy, everything goes really, really simple. All the neurons in a certain area of the brain, and this can be the entire cerebral hemispheres, but in a certain region of the brain, let's say, all of them start firing really fast and all in synchrony with one another. So they stop firing in an incredible complex array where some are active at the moment, some aren't active at the moment, and the next moment it's changed. They stop firing like that. Instead, they all just fire at once. They behave in a very, very simplistic way, and that's what gives rise to epileptic convulsions and epileptic seizures. Indeed, that's what an epileptic seizure is. Loads of neurons in a certain region of the brain no longer firing in a sophisticated, complicated manner, but instead just firing off all in synchrony with one another at a ridiculous rate. And they're no longer in that complex arrangement anymore, so there's no longer logical thought coming out of it anymore. They're just behaving in this very simple way. Cortical spreading depression is not quite as extreme as epilepsy, but it's a phenomenon similar to that, because what's going to happen is nerve cells of the cerebral cortex are no longer going to be firing according to the incredibly complicated, sophisticated way that they should be anymore, and a much simpler process is going to take its place instead, like in epilepsy, but it's different to in epilepsy. In cortical spreading depression, you get overactivity followed by underactivity, and this should ring bells when we were discussing about the aura that can occur in migraine earlier, and indeed it does for a reason. So, without further ado, let me describe exactly what happens in cortical spreading depression. So, for the sake of having an example, let's say that this region of cerebral cortex that I've just pointed to on my little picture here, and I'll just now mark it in white there, let's say that this little dot of cerebral cortex there is going to be the place where cortical spreading depression is going to originate. So we've had our person suffering from migraine, they've been exposed to a trigger of the migraine attack, and now this is what's going to happen. So somewhere on the cerebral cortex, and in different migraine attacks and in different people, it's going to arise in different areas. What will happen is cortical spreading depression will start. So we're going to imagine it's going to start in this region here. Now, what happens is that little portion of cerebral cortex where it's originated from, it's going to firstly go through a little period of overactivity. So all of the neurons in that little piece of cerebral cortex are going to start firing action potentials much, much faster than they should be. So they all become hyperactive, and this is no longer sophisticated firing, this is all just simplistic firing. They're just firing at a ridiculously fast rate, all in synchrony with one another. So the neurons here start firing very, very rapidly, so you get a moment of hyperactivity. And that can last for, at the maximum a few minutes maybe. Okay, in that little region there. Then what follows after the hyperactivity is a much longer period of depression, which is why the phenomenon is overall called cortical spreading depression, and we don't even refer to the hyperactivity in the name that occurs initially, because the depression is the much more longer lasting part of this. So they fire very, very rapidly for a while, and then they go into a phase where they fire really, really infrequently. So they go into a depressed period. And this depressed period will last much longer than the hyperactive period. It can last for a few minutes to up to an hour, and you'll notice that that's the same as what I previously told you is the sort of duration of migraine auras, and that's not a coincidence. That's because the phenomenon of cortical spreading depression, if it occurs in certain regions of the cerebral cortex, such as the primary visual cortex, can give rise to the migraine aura. Okay, so let's continue on this discussion of what actually happens then. So this portion of cerebral cortex, for a few seconds to a few minutes maximum, it will be undergoing hyperactivity, where all of the neurons are firing at a very fast rate, and then after that's finished, it will go into a depressed phase, which will last much longer, from a few minutes to up to an hour, where they will be firing at a much reduced level. Now, it's not necessarily that they're going to be firing not at all. They might be firing not at all, but often some of them will still be firing, it's just at a much lower frequency than they would have been. So overall, the activity in this region of cortex will be depressed. So, hyperactivity followed by underactivity. This is the phenomenon of cortical spreading depression. However, we need to justify another part, the spreading. We haven't seen it spreading yet. So, of course, we're now going to discuss that. this phenomenon spreads. It's not just going to stay in this one little dot of cerebral cortex, it's going to spread to the surrounding portions of cerebral cortex. So the surrounding portions of cerebral cortex are also going to undergo this hyperactivity followed by underactivity. So let me show this here. So I'll just make my little bit of cortex there a little bit bigger. So there's the original spot of cerebral cortex that undergoes the CSD, and now the surrounding piece of cortex, which I'm putting in here in pink, that's going to undergo CSD. So once the first bit's undergone CSD, it undergoes hyperactivity followed by underactivity. It'll then spread to the surrounding portion of cortex. And again, that surrounding portion of cortex will firstly undergo hyperactivity followed by underactivity. So really what's actually going to happen is you can imagine that the rim of hyperactivity is spreading outwards, and in its wake, it leaves underactivity. So let's do one more layer on this. So it's going to spread further, and now here in the purple pastel colour, here's a next ring of cerebral cortex. So from the pink ring of cerebral cortex, it's going to spread to the purple ring, and again the purple ring of cerebral cortex. First you'll have hyperactivity, and then afterwards you'll have the much longer period of underactivity. So this is the cortical spreading depression spreading over this portion of cerebral cortex here. Okay, so as I say, a good way of thinking about it is that you have this ring of hyperactivity spreading outwards on the cerebral cortex, and that behind it, in its wake, it leaves a period of depression. It leaves depressed cerebral cortex that will be firing at a infrequent level, i.e. too infrequently. Okay, right, so that is the phenomenon of cortical spreading depression. The next question to ask is, how far will it get? Is it going to take over the entire cerebral cortex? And the answer is generally no, it's not actually going to get over the entire cerebral cortex. And the reason is it spreads very, very slowly. And this gives us a hint as to what might actually be the cause of cortical spreading depression. So firstly, let me write down how slowly it spreads. So it spreads at an incredibly slow rate. Between 2 and 6 millimeters per minute is the spreading rate for cortical spreading depression. So that is not very far at all. 2 millimeters is a very short distance on the surface of the cerebral cortex. I mean, it can be up to 6 millimeters per minute, but it's still a slow progression. So this thing is not spreading fast, it's spreading very slowly over the surface of the cerebral cortex, unlike epilepsy, which can spread extremely rapidly. Now, this is very, very interesting because this gives us some insight. It gives us an idea of what actually might be causing the cortical spreading depression phenomenon. Indeed, this hints that the cause of the cortical spreading depression may well be a diffusible chemical molecule, because that would explain why it spreads so slowly, i.e., cortical spreading depression will be caused at the original portion of cerebral cortex by this diffusible molecule being somehow present in the extracellular fluid in far higher levels than it should have been. So this is what we think probably underlies cortical spreading depression, that somehow the triggers for migraine in migraine susceptible individuals lead to this molecule, whatever its nature is, whatever it actually is, being present in the extracellular fluid at the original place where the cortical spreading depression is going to spread from in far too high levels. And then from that area, it's going to spread out to neighbouring portions of cerebral cortex at this rate. And then when it first arrives in a portion of cerebral cortex, it leads to hyperactivity of the neurons there. So you get the hyperactive portion of the cortical spreading depression. And then afterwards, after you've had after the whole neuron's been bathed in that stuff for a long time, it then causes depression in the activity of the neuron, and therefore leads to the depressed period. And the depressed period will then continue on until this substance is removed from the extracellular fluid. So, of course, the amount of the molecule at the original site would then determine how far the cortical spreading depression phenomenon would actually spread. It would also determine how long the cortical spreading depression actually lasts for. You'd imagine that if there was more molecule at the original site where the CSD started, then that's going to lead to the cortical spreading depression lasting longer and also getting further out, spreading further out. So, that is the phenomenon then of cortical spreading depression, and that's all I can really actually tell you about this phenomenon. I wish I could tell you how it actually occurs. I wish I could tell you what the identity of this molecule that we think is actually causing it is, but at the moment we don't know the answer to that question. There are lots of candidate molecules that we think could be the molecule that underlies cortical spreading depression, but at present we don't know which one it is, and I'm not going to go through the candidate molecules for the cause of cortical spreading depression because I think it actually makes the topic more confusing rather than making it more comprehensible. Okay, so to recite the bit of the story that we've seen so far, we start off with someone who suffers from migraine. So they have the genetic susceptibility that means that this phenomenon, cortical spreading depression, can actually occur in their brain. This brain phenomenon can occur. Then when we expose them to one of the triggers, that's what actually triggers the cortical spreading depression to occur then and there. And what will happen is at the site where the cortical spreading depression starts off, we believe that this molecule of unknown identity, somehow it ends up being in the extracellular fluid in far too high levels, and it then diffuses out from the original site where the cortical spreading depression started and will spread to neighbouring portions of cerebral cortex, and then when it first arrives in a region of cerebral cortex, it leads to hyperactivity of the neurons there, but then once it's been there for a while, it leads to underactivity. So you get this spreading ring of overactivity, and in its wake, it leaves underactivity. Now, in different people, this phenomenon, cortical spreading depression, will occur in different areas. It is what is going to activate the meningeal nociceptors. It's going to activate the meningeal nociceptors that innervate the meninges over the area of cerebral cortex that is actually undergoing the cortical spreading depression. In addition, if it occurs in certain areas, such as for instance if it occurs in the primary visual cortex, then it can give rise to a migraine aura. However, it seems to be that in different people, the tendency for this to happen is in different portions of the cerebral cortex, i.e. in people with migraine with aura, the tendency is for the cortical spreading depression to occur to begin at the primary visual cortex, and potentially it can spread all the way forward to the primary somatosensory cortex, which explains how some people can get the visual aura followed by a sensory aura. In the people who have migraine without aura and do not suffer from migraine headaches with preceding aura, we believe that the cortical spreading depression phenomenon must be occurring in some portion of the brain where it does not actually lead to an aura occurring, but then will activate the meningeal nociceptors and therefore will lead to the development of the migraine headache. Okay, right. So I now want to talk about how this could actually lead to the visual aura. So remember when we were discussing aura, I'll just go back over here. Here's where we discussed aura. We said that a third of people who suffer from migraine with aura, whilst the other 2/3 suffer from migraine without aura. We believe that in both of these types of migraine, it is still cortical spreading depression that is fundamentally causing the headache. However, in people with migraine without aura, we think it's occurring in some portion of the cerebral cortex where it doesn't actually give rise to an aura. Whereas in the people with migraine with aura, we said that most of them get a visual aura. Nearly all of them, in fact, get a visual aura. And we think that that means that the cortical spreading depression is beginning right at the back of the brain in the primary visual cortex on the calcarine sulcus. And then in the half of people with migraine with aura where they get a sensory aura after their visual aura, it's usually the visual aura comes on first and then the sensory aura joins in. We think that that's because the cortical spreading depression has spread forward forward to the primary somatosensory cortex on the same side as the visual cortex that was being affected by the cortical spreading depression. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. So we need to discuss the primary visual cortex now in more detail than we have previously. So in previous videos, we have seen where the primary visual cortex is. We've discussed the fact that it is on the calcarine sulcus. So remember, we have cerebral cortex on both of the cerebral hemispheres that faces into the longitudinal fissure. Here is the right cerebral hemisphere, here is the right calcarine sulcus. This is all cerebral cortex facing into the longitudinal fissure, and here is the calcarine sulcus on this right side. And this is an invagination of this longitudinal fissure facing cerebral cortex inwards, and there will be cerebral cortex lining this calcarine sulcus. There will be a top surface of cerebral cortex and there will be a bottom surface, and that cerebral cortex that lines the calcarine sulcus, that is where the primary visual cortex is. And of course you're having this on both sides. You have a left primary visual cortex on the left calcarine sulcus and a right primary visual cortex on the right calcarine sulcus. Now I just want to remind you of the retinotopic map so that we understand how these visual auras can actually occur. So let me go down here and I'm going to draw you a new picture. So what am I going to draw you? I'm going to draw you a picture looking at the back of the brain, but not in a way that we could ever actually do. I'm going to draw the two cerebral hemispheres, but sort of broken apart from one another. So I've expanded the longitudinal fissure. It's probably best that I actually just draw this and then you can see what I'm drawing. So this is representing then the left cerebral hemisphere, the back of the left cerebral hemisphere, and this surface is supposed to represent that medial surface facing into the longitudinal fissure. So here, this is representing the calcarine sulcus here, and now I'm going to do it for the right hand side here. So, and I'll try and make it as symmetrical as possible. Okay, like so, and again here is the calcarine sulcus. So I hope you understand what I'm drawing here. It looks awful, but it will do the job. It's not symmetric at all. But here, this is meant to represent the medial aspect of the left cerebral hemisphere. So I'm kind of imagining that I've gone to the back of the longitudinal fissure, pulled these two apart, and here they are splayed apart now. So here is the left cerebral hemisphere, the medial cortex facing into the longitudinal fissure. This is the calcarine sulcus. You'll have the superior part of the calcarine sulcus cerebral cortex and the inferior part. Here's the right cerebral hemisphere. Here's its calcarine sulcus facing into the longitudinal fissure. And again, you'll have a superior portion of cerebral cortex and an inferior portion of cerebral cortex. Why have I drawn this awful picture? Because I want to show you the retinotopic map. So let me write that key word down. So when we talked about the primary somatosensory cortex, about the somatotopic map, which was about which portions of the body's sensory information go up to which portions of the primary somatosensory cortex. The retinotopic map is about which portions of the visual field the information is going to go to which portions of the primary visual cortex. So we have the left primary visual cortex here, right primary visual cortex here. I want to know visual information from which portions of the visual field is going to end up on which portions of the calcarine, well, on which portions of the primary visual cortex. Now, strictly speaking, if you look at the name here, retinotopic map, I should really be telling you which portions of the retina go on to which portions of the primary visual cortex. However, I don't quite want to do that. I want to do which portions of the visual field go on to which portions of the primary visual cortex. It's very much so related, although if you think about it, which portions of the retina go up where is slightly different to which portions of the visual field because of the way that the light enters the eyes. But the bit that's important for us to understand is which portions of the visual field go where. So I'm just going to do that rather than talking about the actual retinae, because that just makes it more confusing. So again, I'm going to imagine splitting the visual field here into 4 quadrants, like so. So we did this previously when we were discussing visual auras. So here is the left superior quadrant, the right superior quadrant, the left inferior quadrant, and the right inferior quadrant, because these 4 separate quadrants are going to go to the 4 different portions of cortex that we've got. And the 4 different portions of cortex that we've got is the left superior calcarine fissure cortex, the left inferior calcarine sulcus cortex, and you'll have to put up with me constantly moving between calling it the calcarine fissure and the calcarine sulcus, I apologise. The right superior calcarine sulcus cortex and the right inferior calcarine sulcus cortex. So, how does this work then? Well, you remember when we were discussing the somatotopic map on the primary somatosensory cortex, that it was exactly the opposite way to how you would imagine it. Remember, the left primary somatosensory cortex controls the right side of the body, or feels sensation from the right side of the body. The right primary somatosensory cortex feels sensation from the left side of the body. And remember, the body was effectively upside down as well. So the bottom of the body, the feet, went to the top of the primary somatosensory cortex, and the top of the body, the head, went to the bottom of the primary somatosensory cortex. It's exactly the same when we're discussing the retinotopic map on the primary visual cortexes as well. The left visual hemifield is going to go to the right-hand side, and the right visual hemifield is going to go to the left-hand side, and top and bottom is going to be switched over as well. So left superior quadrant of the visual field is going to go to right inferior primary visual cortex, whereas the left inferior visual quadrant here is going to go to the right superior portion of cortex of the calcarine sulcus here. So, and the same on the other side. So let's just color code this in to make it make sense. So, we'll start off with this quadrant here. So this is the left superior quadrant of the visual field, and that's now going to go to the portion of cerebral cortex lining the bottom of the calcarine sulcus on the right-hand side here. Next, in blue, let's do the left inferior quadrant here of the visual field, and visual information from that region is going to be relayed directly up to the right portion of cerebral cortex that lines the top of the calcarine sulcus, so there in blue. Carrying on, getting some more colours, let's have aquamarine. So on the right visual hemifield now, so the right superior visual quadrant, information from that is going to go to the cerebral cortex on the left-hand side that lines the bottom of the calcarine sulcus. And finally, we'll go for red, the final quadrant down here, right inferior visual quadrant. Information from that is going to be relayed up to the calcarine cortex that is above the calcarine sulcus on the left-hand side here. Okay, so they're in red. So this is the retinotopic map, the map that shows us which portions of the visual field, the sensory information from that is going to be relayed to which portions of the two primary visual cortexes on either side of the brain in the two cerebral hemispheres. Right, I want to actually go into this in a little bit more detail, however, more detail still, because to justify the fact that the visual aura in migraine is going to start right at the centre, we need to know a little bit more about the retinotopic map. And the information that I want is the centre portions of each quadrant. Where does that go on the portions of the cerebral cortex that I've shown you so far? And then as you go more laterally, how does it progress? So here, let's just do it for one example. Let's go for the left superior visual quadrant here. So, this is a big portion of the visual field. All I've told you so far is very crude information. I've told you that the information here is going to go onto this portion of cerebral cortex here. But this is a big quadrant. Can I not give you some more specific information? And I can. So, the bits of the left superior quadrant that are most towards the centre, and I'll mark this in here, so the central portions here, and I'll grade it out in fact. So I've now split it up into these different levels as far as how peripheral from the centre of the visual field it is. So this bit is very towards the centre of the visual field. This is the portion of the left superior quadrant that's further away, and then this bit's further away still, and you can carry on. So my question is there a pattern as to where these different portions of the visual field that are further away from the centre is actually going to go to on this portion of cerebral cortex that is at the bottom of the right calcarine sulcus? And the answer is yes. The portion that is right towards the centre, that's going to be right at the back. Then as we get further away from the centre, it moves forwards. So this will be at this sort of bit, and then this bit will be further forward still, and this bit further forward still. So my message is that in each of the quadrants, as you get further from the centre, it's going to go forward along that piece of cortex, and this isn't, as I say, it's not just true for this one. If we now go to this one so that you completely get the idea here, I can grade that one as well. So let me get the aquamarine pen back again. So here's the portion of the right superior quadrant that's very close to the centre of the visual field. Then the bit further away still, and then we can put another grading on. So we can split this right superior visual quadrant into these different levels of visual space that are further away from the centre of the visual field. And now let me tell you where information from each of these different levels is going to go on this left inferior portion of cerebral cortex over here. The bit that's near the centre, same pattern, is going to be right at the back. The bit that's further away is going to be more forward. This bit's going to be further forward still. This bit's going to be further forward still. So I hope you're starting to get the message, and it continues on in all of these. So if I was to look at this portion of cerebral cortex here on the top and the bottom, that is telling me about this central portion of the visual field here on the left-hand side. Obviously, the green is superior and the blue is then inferior. And then as I move forward, I'm getting further and further out from the centre of the visual field. Okay, so there's some more detail about the way the retinotopic map works. Right, so it's now a good idea to think about what would happen if the phenomenon of cortical spreading depression was to occur in one of the primary visual cortexes, and I hope you will come to the conclusion that it would give rise to a scintillating scotoma. Now remember, the two primary visual cortexes are separated by the falx cerebri, so cortical spreading depression starting in one of them is very unlikely to spread to the other cerebral hemisphere, and indeed this is the reason that migraine headaches are usually unilateral, because usually the cortical spreading depression starts on one side of the brain in one of the cerebral hemispheres, either left or right, and it doesn't cross over into the other cerebral hemisphere because remember, it's a substance diffusing, and it would be a big diffusion for that to have to get across the falx cerebri, so it doesn't usually spread into the other cerebral hemisphere. That's the reason that the headache, the activation of the meningeal nociceptors is usually on just one side, usually unilateral. And that's the reason that the aura, if you get it, that arises because of the cortical spreading depression is again usually just on one side rather than being on both sides. However, of course, migraines can very rarely be bilateral, and somehow then you must have cortical spreading depression on both sides, maybe because it's simultaneously arisen in two places on separate cerebral hemispheres, who knows. But usually it's unilateral because the cortical spreading depression is not going to spread to the other cerebral hemisphere. So, for an example, let's imagine that we are going to start cortical spreading depression occurring in this left primary visual cortex here, and it often starts right at the back of the occipital lobe. So let's imagine we start it right at the back here of the occipital lobe, and think about what would happen. We've discussed this phenomenon. It's a spreading rim of hyperexcitation, hyperactivity, followed by depression. So you'd get this spreading over the primary visual cortex on this side, and this is encoding information, this is receiving information rather, from the right visual hemifield. So what would you see? Well, initially the hyperactivity would reach this bit right at the back of the callicrine sulcus first, on above and below here. Okay, and therefore what would you see? You'd see bright flashing lights right in the centre because those neurons there are overactive. So it would make you see bright flashing lights in the middle. That's what hyperactivity in the primary visual cortex relates to, what it would actually be seen as. Remember, the primary visual cortex is very, very simple. It's where the unprocessed visual information is actually coming to, just like the primary somatosensory cortex was. There are more advanced portions of cortex up here that do the more advanced processing rather than programming. So when you get hyperexcitability or hyperactivity right at the back, that will correspond to bright flashing lights here. As that spreads forward, those bright flashing lights would spread out exactly how we've seen a scintillating scotoma works. And then in the wake of the bright flashing lights, you get blurriness, you get the scotoma, maybe even complete darkness. And that is what you would get when the depression kicks in. So after the hyperactivity, we know that you get depression, which lasts for much longer, and that would precisely correspond to the blurriness that you see inside of the rim of bright flashing lights. And we know that this can spread right across, so that the bright flashing lights have completely made their way across the entire visual hemifield, so that now you just see blurriness in the entire visual hemifield, and that would correspond to the entire of the primary visual cortex on the left-hand side here being in the depressed state at the moment. So what I hopefully have just convinced you of is that if we set the cortical spreading depression phenomenon as occurring in the back of the left cerebral hemisphere here, it would give rise to a right scintillating scotoma which could expand to become a right hemianopia. And of course, how far it gets would depend on how much of the substance you have. Maybe if you had very little of the substance, it wouldn't get all the way across the calcarine sulcus, and therefore the scintillating scotoma wouldn't expand to full hemianopia. So hopefully I have kind of justified now where the migraine aura can come from the cortical spreading depression phenomenon directly. Then what's going to happen, and we'll discuss this much more later, is that the cortical spreading depression occurring on this left cerebral hemisphere cerebral cortex will activate overlying meningeal nociceptors, and that will give rise to a left-sided headache. So you've got a right visual field scintillating scotoma expanding to hemianopia potentially, with a left-sided headache, and that could explain migraine with aura. And indeed, that's our story of where migraine with aura comes from. Right, now to discuss how this could actually progress to a sensory aura as well. Well, remember, the primary somatosensory cortex is not too far away. Come back to this picture. The primary somatosensory cortex is here. We have started off, in migraine with aura, we believe that the cortical spreading depression usually starts off in the occipital lobe. Okay, so in people who are going to have a migraine with aura, we've discussed the fact that it's usually a visual aura. Nearly all of them get a visual aura. So we think that means that there must be a tendency somehow for it to start in the occipital poles of the brain. So it's going to spread over the calcarine sulcus medially, but it could also spread forward over this cerebral cortex to get to the primary visual cortex here. Of course, this would require a lot of whatever the substance is that is driving the cortical spreading depression for it to be able to spread this far. But what would you get if you did have the sensory aura? And you would get it first arriving where? If you imagine it expanding out from here, which bit is it going to hit first? Well, in my head, I think it's going to hit this bit first. And where would that correspond to? Again, remember, hyperactivity followed by underactivity. That bit of primary somatosensory cortex there, that's the bit that corresponds to the arm and the hand. So this would make sense for why you get tingling, which is the overactivity initially, followed by numbness, which is the underactivity, and it usually starts off in the hand because the phenomenon is most likely to hit this portion of the primary somatosensory cortex first, and then it will expand into the other regions. It will expand upwards to go down to the feet. Again, this tingling followed by numbness, and then it can go downwards in the primary somatosensory cortex to get up to the face. So that would explain how you can get this expanding region of tingling followed by numbness as a sensory aura in migraine. And that would, of course, have to follow the visual aura because the visual cortex is closer to where the cortical spreading depression usually occurs. And again, this would appear on the contralateral side. So just as cortical spreading depression on the left primary visual cortex caused the visual aura in the right visual hemifield, a cortical spreading depression occurring in the left primary somatosensory cortex will lead to a sensory aura on the right side of the body, and the headache that you will get will be a left-sided headache because you will activate the meninges on the same side as the cortical spreading depression is actually occurring. So this theory is beautifully explaining how you can get a visual aura, and how in some people you can get a visual aura and then a sensory aura as well. Now, with regards to why the aura is usually before the actual headache, we think that's because in order for the cortical spreading depression phenomenon to actually activate the meningeal nociceptors, we think something has to diffuse over to the meningeal nociceptors. So you might think that the way the meningeal nociceptors could be activated by cortical spreading depression, it might be because of the actual electrical phenomenon. It might be because of the hyperexcited neurons at the rim of the cortical spreading depression. Somehow their electrical overactivity might excite the meningeal nociceptors, but we don't think that that is the reason, because otherwise you would expect the aura to be present at the same time as the headache. You wouldn't expect it to precede the headache. So it seems to give rise to that delay that something from the cortical spreading depression has to be taking its time to get to the meningeal nociceptors to actually activate them. And therefore, again, we think that it is some chemical mediator diffusing from the area of cerebral cortex that has undergone this phenomenon of cortical spreading depression over to the meningeal nociceptors that takes time and that then activates the meningeal nociceptors much, much later. And that's usually why the aura comes before the actual headache, because the cortical spreading depression directly causes the neurological symptoms of the aura straight away, whereas you've got that delay for whatever it is, this mediator, to get to the meningeal nociceptors. And that mediator that is diffusing to the meningeal nociceptors might not be the same mediator that is actually causing the cortical spreading depression phenomenon itself, because when this occurs, due to whatever the primary chemical actually is, loads of other chemicals go up in this area, and that's why it's so difficult to actually determine which one is causing it, because a lot of the other ones that are going up at the same time might just be following on from the phenomenon that the original ones caused. So the mediator that is going to activate the meningeal nociceptors need not be the mediator that is actually causing the initial phenomenon, but we do think it's probably another chemical diffusing to the meningeal nociceptors that activates them. Right. Next, let's talk about motor aura. We discussed how in some people you can actually get motor auras. In those cases, the cortical spreading depression must actually be affecting the primary motor cortex. It must be arising in the primary motor cortex, roughly this level. I haven't told you about the map for the primary motor cortex, but it's very similar to the map for the primary somatosensory cortex. So the primary motor cortex, in fact, I don't think I've told you anything about the primary motor cortex, so let's just put a little bit of this information on this picture here. So, in front of the central sulcus, there is a portion of cerebral cortex, again on a gyrus, and this gyrus is called the precentral gyrus. So the primary somatosensory cortex was on the post-central gyrus, the gyrus behind the central sulcus. The primary motor cortex, which we call M1, is on the gyrus in front of the central sulcus, which is called the precentral gyrus. Now, it's exactly the same sort of map as we had for the primary somatosensory cortex. The left primary motor cortex controls the right side of the body, and the right primary motor cortex controls the left side of the body. Now, just as the primary somatosensory cortexes and the primary visual cortexes have sensory information that is pretty much unprocessed relayed directly to them, the primary motor cortex is pretty much, again, a nice relay station. It's going to relay information downwards to the muscles of the body. So signals, motor instructions come from these more anterior portions of the cerebral cortex. They come up with the fancy plans, the motor plans of which muscles we need to contract to what extent. The primary motor cortex contains neurons that will then go down in the corticospinal tract and synapse directly onto the alpha motor neurons that actually control the muscles. And so the primary motor cortex is effectively a motor relay station with lots of neurons on it that will control certain muscles in the body by synapsing onto the alpha motor neuron down in the spinal cord that will control that muscle. So there is a map on the primary motor cortex which shows you each region of the primary motor cortex, which sort of region of the body does it actually control, and it's very similar to the sensory one. Again, right at the top you're going to have the bottom of the body, the feet, and then as you go down it'll be the arms, and then right down to the bottom it'll be the head region. Okay, and of course it's on the contralateral side, so this would be the right foot, this would be the right arm, this would be the right head region. So in motor auras, we would assume that the cortical spreading depression would have to arise in the primary motor cortex. It probably arises in the middle here, so that you get the overactivation, which will cause the tremor, arising first in the hand and then spreading upwards and downwards. So when it spreads upwards along the primary motor cortex, that will trigger the bottom of the body, the lower limb, the leg and the foot, to start tremoring, and as it spreads downwards on the primary motor cortex, that will correspond to upwards on the contralateral side of the body, so that will cause the tremor to rise up the body towards the facial region. And it will be followed by weakness, which will be corresponding to the depression in the activity of these neurons in the primary motor cortex. Okay, so that's what would happen in a motor aura, and again it would give rise to the symptoms on the contralateral side as far as the aura is concerned. So you would get a right-sided motor aura if we were having cortical spreading depression occurring in the left primary motor cortex, and you would then get a left-sided headache because it would activate the meningeal nociceptors over the left-hand side here. Well, in the left meninges covering that portion of cerebral cortex. Right, so I've now explained to you where the preceding auras come from. We will explore more in the next video where the actual pain comes from, where the headache comes from. We want to discuss how the meningeal nociceptors are going to be activated and how they can remain activated for so long, because that's something you should be questioning. I've told you that the cortical spreading depression phenomenon, the depression usually lasts for at the most an hour, the time that the aura lasts for. Once the aura's gone, that's the cortical spreading depression done, because remember, the cortical spreading depression is causing the aura. However, the headache can go on for hours and hours and up to, 3 days and even beyond 3 days, status migrainosus. So how can the pain, the activation of the meningeal nociceptors, go on for so much longer, even though the cortical spreading depression phenomenon has ended? And another thing I want to say just at this point is this is obviously migraine with aura. What happens in migraine without aura? Again, we believe it's this same phenomenon. We still think cortical spreading depression is going to occur on some portion of cerebral cortex in people suffering from a migraine without aura, but it will be occurring somewhere else, on some portion of cerebral cortex that doesn't actually give rise to any sort of aura if this cortical spreading depression occurs there. So not in the occipital lobe, therefore. And then it will still give rise to the phenomenon that then leads to the activation of the meningeal nociceptors, which will cause the headache, the unilateral headache, but it doesn't actually give rise to any neurological phenomenon. So to summarise what we've so far seen about the pathophysiology of migraine headache, people with migraine without aura, you're going to get cortical spreading depression occurring in some region of the cerebral cortex where it's not actually going to cause any neurological symptoms. It's then going to lead to the activation of the meningeal nociceptors. We'll talk about that much more later on, which will then lead to the headache. So you just get the unilateral headache, which normally unilateral headache, and I hope you understand why it's normally unilateral now. In migraine with aura, it's usually a visual aura that you get, and then it can be accompanied by a sensory aura. And there, what we think happens is the cortical spreading depression seems to have a tendency in people with migraine without aura to start right at the occipital pole of one of the cerebral hemispheres, and then it affects the primary visual cortex, causing the unilateral visual aura, and then it can spread forward to affect the primary somatosensory cortex, and therefore can give rise to a sensory aura as well, and then of course will activate the meningeal nociceptors and give rise to the actual headache, which will be on the contralateral side to the aura symptoms. Okay, but of course people with migraine with aura, they don't necessarily always have migraine attacks that are preceded by an aura. They can have migraine attacks that aren't preceded by an aura, and in those migraine attacks, presumably the cortical spreading depression starts somewhere else, not in the occipital pole, somewhere where it doesn't give rise to the neurological symptoms of an aura. Very, very rarely, only usually in those rare cases of migraine sufferers who have familial hemiplegic migraine, does the cortical spreading depression ever actually arise in the primary motor cortex, thank goodness. And in those people, it will give rise to the motor aura, and we understand how that motor aura will then be on the opposite side of the body to the headache that will then occur afterwards. Now, before we end this video and have a break, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what is actually happening in cortical spreading depression, some clues as to why this phenomenon can occur in some people and not in others. So we've discussed how most people with migraine, it's polygenic. There are loads of genes that are involved in somehow allowing the brain to actually undergo this process, and in people without migraine, their brains don't ever have this process occurring in them. However, that's not well understood at all. The polygenic cases of migraine we don't really understand. We don't know, well, we'll have ideas about which genes are important, but we don't have a good picture of how it actually all fits together yet. However, we can get clues by looking at familial hemiplegic migraine, which, remember, is monogenic. So these are cases of migraine that usually give rise to the cortical spreading depression phenomenon in the primary motor cortex here, that are actually caused by a single allele of a single gene. So I now just want to explore with you what actual genes are responsible for the different types of familial hemiplegic migraine. So let's go over here and do this. We'll stay here. So I'll just write down, we are discussing familial hemiplegic migraine, FHM. Now, when I told you about familial hemiplegic migraine previously, I told you that there were 3 different types: familial hemiplegic migraine 1, familial hemiplegic migraine 2, and familial hemiplegic migraine 3. And they're in order of prevalence. FHM1 is the most prevalent. They're all extremely rare, but of the 3, this one's the most common of the types of familial hemiplegic migraine. So most people who have familial hemiplegic migraine, if you wanted to bet which type they have, it would be this type. Second most common type is familial hemiplegic migraine type 2, and the last one is familial hemiplegic migraine type 3, which is very rare, we think, at this current stage. Okay, and I want to now talk about what the genes that cause these different types of familial hemiplegic migraine actually are. So let's start off with familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. And we'll see from looking at this that all of these genes that can have alleles which can actually give rise to this rare form of migraine are actually involved in electrophysiology, in controlling electrolyte levels inside and outside of the cells, and also controlling what the electrical potential difference is across the cells. And considering that this phenomenon is probably very much so in, tied up with electrophysiology. This is kind of consistent. I mean, studying this is not going to paint us a complete picture of how this can work. It's just going to give us some tantalizing hints as to what might be important in actually setting off cortical spreading depression. Okay, and it will also give you a bit more knowledge about familial hemiplegic migraine. So, familial hemiplegic migraine type 1, what is the protein that is important here? Well, it is an alpha-1 subunit of a voltage-gated calcium channel. So, let me just remind you about the structure of voltage-gated calcium channels, which I'll abbreviate down to VGCCs. So, these are an extremely important protein in electrophysiology. They're in cell membranes, and they can be opened by depolarization of the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane, and they will allow calcium to enter from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid. And remember, calcium in the outside fluid is extremely high concentration, whereas the calcium in the intracellular fluid is extremely low concentration. So let me just remind you about the structure of voltage-gated calcium channels, because they're made up of lots of different proteins. So here is the phospholipid bilayer, and now let me draw on the different parts of a voltage-gated calcium channel. So we start off with the major portion, the bit that is actually the pore-forming unit, the bit that actually has the tunnel through which calcium ions move. So this bit is the pore-forming unit, and this subunit is called the alpha-1 subunit. And I just told you that familial hemiplegic migraine type 1 is going to be caused by having a certain allele of a certain type of alpha-1 subunit. So it's nice that at least it's the most important subunit of the voltage-gated calcium channel that is going wrong here, rather than some more minor subunit. So there's the alpha-1 subunit, the major pore-forming unit. And now, just for a bit of background, let me tell you about the other subunits. These are all just auxiliary subunits. They do not actually perform the function of opening in response to depolarization and allowing calcium to move through. That is completed by the pore-forming unit that I've just drawn here. But these are important in modulating how the pore-forming unit works. So you also have a beta subunit here. So this is the beta subunit, which is attached to the cytoplasmic aspect of the alpha-1 subunit, like I've shown there. So just to orient you, this is the extracellular fluid, this is the intracellular fluid. So when you're building a voltage-gated calcium channel, you don't just have the alpha-1 subunit on its own. Even though that would function on its own, they're not built on their own. They have other subunits attached on, and I'm just telling you about those now. So here is the beta subunit. Then you have a gamma subunit, so we're just going through the Greek letters, and the gamma subunit is also transmembrane, sitting alongside the alpha-1 here. So alpha-1 goes across the cell membrane, gamma also goes across the cell membrane, beta is attached to the cytoplasmic aspect of alpha-1, and then the final one is alpha-2 delta. So let me put this in here. So here it is. This is called alpha-2 delta, and it's made out of the alpha-2 subunit and the delta subunit joined together. However, you might ask, well, why do we view this as being one subunit of the voltage-gated calcium channel? It's because the proteins that make the alpha-2 subunit and the delta subunit, and by the way, the bit at the top is the alpha-2 subunit, and the bit that goes across the cell membrane is the delta subunit, and it's attached to the side of the alpha-1 subunit. The reason we call this one subunit is because these proteins, the delta and the alpha-2, they are made on the same polypeptide. So you synthesize a pre-protein or a pro-protein, and then you chop it in two. So a pro-protein comes out of the ribosomes, fresh from protein synthesis, you chop it in two, and that becomes the alpha-2 subunit and the delta subunit. So they're actually coded for by the same gene, which makes a protein that is both the alpha-2 and delta together, and then that's chopped in two to make an alpha-2 subunit and a delta subunit, and then they join back together, but not by a peptide link, by a disulfide link. So that's why we call this one subunit, even though this is not just one polypeptide, it's two separate polypeptides joined by a non-peptide link here. Okay, so those are the 4 subunits of a voltage-gated calcium channel. The alpha-1 subunit, which is the most important one, that's the pore-forming unit, but then also the auxiliary subunits, the beta subunit, the gamma subunit, and the alpha-2 delta subunit, and they're involved in controlling things like what voltage this thing actually decides that it should be open at. They're involved in deciding things like where it actually locates in the cell membrane, which part of the cell it's actually going to locate itself at. How fast is it going to open when the voltage across the cell membrane goes beyond its threshold potential? They determine things like that, so they influence its behaviour hugely. Now, so there's the basic structure of a voltage-gated calcium channel. I'm going to throw more biochemistry at you, however. When we look at alpha-1 subunits for voltage-gated calcium channels, it would be beautifully simple if there was just one. If there was one gene that was the alpha-1 subunit for voltage-gated calcium channels, that would be absolutely marvellous. It would be so simple. Unfortunately, it's not the case. There are actually 10 different genes for alpha-1 subunits of voltage-gated calcium channels, and that is not counting the homologous chromosomes. Of course, for each one of these 10 different genes, there'll be 2 copies of it on the 2 homologous chromosomes. So there are a lot of different genes for alpha-1 subunits of voltage-gated calcium channels, and these do all have slightly different properties. They make slightly different voltage-gated calcium channels. So let me now tell you the names of these different genes for alpha-1 subunits of voltage-gated calcium channels, and the reason we are doing this is because one of them is going to be involved in familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. So we label them up Ca for calcium, then we put a subscript V like so, which is for voltage-gated calcium channel, and then we split them into 3 families, and the 3 families are CAV1, CAV2, and CAV3. Now, the CAV1 family is the biggest. That contains 4 members. That contains the genes CAV1.1, CAV1.2, CAV1.3, all the way up to CAV1.4. So all of these 4 things, CAV1.1, CAV1.2, CAV1.3, and CAV1.4, they are all the names for certain types of alpha-1 subunits of voltage-gated calcium channels, and they're coded for by separate genes in the genome. And of course, each of them you'll have 2 copies of that gene on the 2 homologous chromosomes. Okay, right. And if you use one of those alpha-1 subunits to make your voltage-gated calcium channel, then you call that voltage-gated calcium channel an L-type voltage-gated calcium channel. So when someone talks about an L-type voltage-gated calcium channel, and believe me, in electrophysiology they love these things, they're very, very important. This is what it means. It means that the alpha-1 subunit of the voltage-gated calcium channel is in this CAV1 family. It's CAV1.1 to CAV1.4. The CAV2 family is smaller but more complicated. It contains CAV2.1, CAV2.2, and CAV2.3. Now, why have I bothered to draw write all of these out separately? It's because if you make a voltage-gated calcium channel out of these different ones, you don't refer to them all by the same name this time. All of these different alpha-1 subunits up here, the CAV1.1s, all of the voltage-gated calcium channels you could make there, the 4 different alpha-1 subunits you could use to make your voltage-gated calcium channel, they were all still referred to as L-type. It's not the same here. It's more complicated. If you make a voltage-gated calcium channel with the CAV2.1 alpha-1 subunit, you call that a PQ-type voltage-gated calcium channel. If you make a voltage-gated calcium channel out of a CAV2.2 alpha-1 subunit, you call that an N-type voltage-gated calcium channel. And if you make a voltage-gated calcium channel out of a CAV2.3 alpha-1 subunit, you call that an R-type voltage-gated calcium channel. So that's the reason that I wrote them all out. Now, CAV3, it's the small one, and it's another small one rather, and it's very simple. So in CAV3 family, you have 3 genes, the CAV3.1 all the way up to the CAV3.3, and if you make a voltage-gated calcium channel out of any one of those alpha-1 subunit types, you call that a T-type voltage-gated calcium channel. So this is what all these different types of voltage-gated calcium channels, what those namings mean. It refers to what type of alpha-1 subunit you use to make your voltage-gated calcium channel. Now there are also different variants of the beta, gamma, and alpha-2 delta subunits. I'm not even going to go there with their names, but there are multiple different beta subunits and multiple different gamma subunits and multiple different alpha-2 delta subunits that you can use in building your voltage-gated calcium channel. They do not matter. As far as naming the voltage-gated calcium channel is concerned, you name it according to what the alpha-1 subunit is, because that's the most important subunit, and these are the names you use. L-type means that the alpha-1 subunit is in the CAV1 family. T-type means that the alpha-1 subunit is in the CAV3 family. PQ-type means that the alpha-1 subunit is CAV2.1. N-type the alpha-1 subunit is CAV2.2. R-type, the alpha-1 subunit is CAV2.3. So, I've now told you about the 10 different genes for alpha-1 subunits in humans. So, which one is it that is involved in familial hemiplegic migraine type 1? Well, take your pick, have a guess. It is CAV2.1 here, so I'll box this one in purple. This is the one that is important in familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. So, I do not know what chromosome specifically this is on, but it is autosomal, so it will be on one of the autosomes, not on one of the sex chromosomes. Therefore, you will have 2 copies of the gene for CAV2.1. Now, for the CAV2.1 gene, there are loads of different alleles in the population. So there are loads of different alleles that you can have in those positions of your genome for CAV2.1. Certain of those alleles that exist, if you have them, and you only need 1 copy of them, will give you familial hemiplegic migraine, and specifically familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. So, this is autosomal dominant. I'll remind you of that. I told you this earlier. So all of the different types of familial hemiplegic migraine are autosomal dominant. So what that means is that the genes responsible for causing them are on autosomes. In this case, CAV2.1's gene is an autosomal gene, so you have 2 copies of it, but the disease alleles, you only need 1 copy of them. So there are loads of alleles for CAV2.1 in the population. Loads of them will not give you familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. And if you have 2 copies, 2 alleles that are not disease alleles, you will not get familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. However, if you have one of those alleles, one of the copies of the gene in your genome is one of the disease alleles, you will get familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. And there is not just one disease allele, there are loads of different alleles of CAV2.1 that will all give you familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. So of the massive great population, and I'll draw a little Venn diagram to show this. So if this set here, this blob is representing a set, I don't care if you don't like maths, this blob is representing a set. So imagine that we put in this loads of little dots, and I will do, and all these dots represent alleles that exist in the human population for the CAV2.1 gene. Now, a subset of those, and there will be absolutely loads of them, a subset of those in purple here is the ones that if you have one of those, and you only need 1 of them, you don't need 2 of them, it's dominant, remember, if you have 1 of those, you will get familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. You will get dysfunctional, in some way, voltage-gated calcium channels being produced from that allele, and they will somehow lead to you being at risk of getting cortical spreading depression occurring in the primary motor cortex, and therefore getting migraine with motor aura, familial hemiplegic migraine. Okay, so that's what I mean by there being multiple different disease-causing alleles, that if you have just 1 of those in one of your sockets for the CAV2.1 gene, you will get the disease. Okay, so that's familial hemiplegic migraine type 1. Let's now go on to familial hemiplegic migraine type 2. And I've just realised that this video has been going on for 1 hour and 6 minutes, so I will actually have a break here, and in the next video we'll discuss familial hemiplegic migraine type 2 and familial hemiplegic migraine type 3, what genes are responsible for those as well. I can't go on much longer, otherwise it will mean that the file's too big and it will crash the device, so I must have a break.